All right. Bureaucracies are also regulators. Regulation of the economy and in everyday life. This is the use of government authority to control or change some practice in the private sector. Federal agencies check, verify, and inspect many of the products and services we take for granted. For example, how do you know the meat that you're going to eat isn't going to make you sick? Well, because the federal government monitors that. How do you know that the car you're in won't explode when it's hit from behind in a traffic accident? The federal government monitors that. These are examples of regulation. Federal and state agencies provide many services. At the state level, you may think of your automobile inspection, and of course, here in Texas, we now do checks on how much pollution your car is putting out, the check on your exhaust, to try to make sure the air is cleaner. That's regulation. That's state, not federal, but nonetheless. All regulation contains these elements: a grant of power and a set of directions from Congress. So you're told, the agency is told, you need to make sure this happens, and if it doesn't happen, here's how you punish the people who aren't doing it. A set of rules and guidelines from the regulatory agency itself, so then the regulatory agency sits down and writes rules to try to meet Congress's goal. Some means of enforcing compliance, you have to have that. You have to have some way to force people to do what you want. In my example, granted at state level, if you don't get your car inspected, you'll get pulled over and get a ticket from the cops for not having your inspection sticker current. If a company is violating pollution rules, they may be fined or ultimately shut down because they're, say, putting mercury out into the air. Command and control policy. The government tells business how to reach certain goals, checks the progress, and punishes offenders. That's one sort. So, for example, they've recently passed a law saying that that cars have to get, 35 or 40 miles to the gallon by a certain year. And so what the agency in charge of this is going to do is go around and check and make sure that car manufacturers are increasing that gas mileage. And then if they don't, they're going to be hit with a fine for every car they make that doesn't meet that standard. That's a command and control policy. You can also have an incentive system. This is where you reward companies for meeting your targets. A great example of this would have been desegregation. Remember, the schools are desegregated legally in 1954, but there's very little desegregation in the South until LBJ says, okay, if you want federal money, you'll desegregate your schools. They put an incentive to it. And so now the schools in the South, they didn't want to, but they desegregated because they wanted that money. Some agencies are proactive, meaning they encourage you to do what they want you to do. Some are reactive, meaning they just wait for you to screw up and then punish you. These are two different approaches. Deregulation is the lifting of restrictions on business, industry, and professional activities. And there are regulatory problems. Regulation can raise prices. There is some truth to the idea that, let's say, when they said that cars had to have catalytic converters to reduce the pollution coming out of the exhaust. Well, putting the catalytic converter onto the car was a cost the manufacturer had to bear, and some of that cost made the car more expensive, so it was passed on to the consumer. It hurts U.S.'s competitive position abroad if we have to follow rules that maybe a foreign manufacturer doesn't. For example, 40-hour work week. We're supposed to pay workers overtime, but they work more than 40 hours. Well, China doesn't pay worker overtime for working more than 40 hours. So that makes it easier and cheaper for a Chinese manufacturer to make a product than one here in the United States. Now, is that worth having a 40-hour work week and a weekend and that sort of thing? I guess that's your decision, but if you're an employer, you may not think it is. If you're an employee, you probably think it is worth it. And, of course, regulation doesn't always work well. We screw up regulation all the time, and you have to be careful. You have to be monitoring every regulation, paying attention to it, and make sure it's accomplishing the goal at once without doing unnecessary things. There was a great wave of deregulation beginning in the late 70s and through the 80s. Some of it was a bit disastrous. But a lot of it was necessary. For example, the airline industry was so heavily regulated, it had created a situation where airline tickets were way higher than they needed to be, and it had the, intended or not, effect of creating little monopolies where airlines could charge whatever they want. Deregulating the airline industry has made air travel a lot cheaper. It's also made the quality go down, and it's also increased the number of crashes of airplanes. So regulation is always tricky. If you remove the rules, it could make things better, it could make things worse, or it could do both. A lot of people talk in broad terms: regulation good, regulation bad. But that's a silly way to look at the world. Some regulations make sense, some don't make sense, some need to be tweaked, and some are fine the way they are. It's difficult work going through and figuring out which ones work well and which ones don't, and how to improve the ones that can be improved. If you want to live in a society that's completely unregulated, I would encourage you to think about that for a minute. By the same token, I doubt many people want to live in a society that's completely regulated. The answer is almost certainly somewhere in the middle.